Table, and we have refreshments, and Ashley is here.
Hi, everybody.
And I'm Pegasus, and we're about to begin the roundtable. And we're really grateful that we have those of you viewers online watching today. We have just a few people in the room today, and we're going to turn it over to Ashley in just a second here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ashley Smith. I'm a member of the Tempest Collective in Vermont, and I'm also a member of the Vermont Mayday Strong Coalition, as well as the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation. Usually I would give these talks along with a migrant justice representative, but given everything that's going on, they're completely busy handling the results of last week's police riot and ICE riot that arrested innocent people and threw them into custody. So they've been very, very busy. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's very important to have migrant workers themselves speak on their own behalf about the struggle that they're in. And that struggle is immense. If you look at what the Trump administration is doing right now, it's truly terrifying. He and his clique of billionaires, white supremacists, right-wing zealots have launched nothing less than a class war on all of us, and they're using the classic strategy of divide and conquer to scapegoat oppressed people in our society, in particular immigrants who are essential workers in our country. And he's unleashed Border Patrol and ICE all across the country, as we've seen, from LA to Chicago to Minneapolis to right here in Vermont to go after immigrant workers. And if anybody had any doubt about the scale of assault in Vermont, I think we saw it on full display last week when the ICE agents got a warrant for an arrest of somebody who was not at the house they went to. And luckily, Migrant Justice heard about this and mobilized several hundred people, neighbors of the family in the house, to defend them and their rights. And what happened is ICE turned up and they escalated the situation, turned it into a conflict, and then called the Vermont State Police, the South Burlington Police, and the Burlington Police Department, which all collaborated together to escalate the conflict. And again, nobody was in the house who had a warrant for arrest at all. So they proceeded to bully their way into the house, shove aside protesters who were defending their neighbors, and storm into the house and arrest 3 people and threaten, including pulling a trigger of a gun that could have killed somebody in the location. And they muscled through the crowd, arrested these 3 people, and then dragged them away and threw them into jail. And they plowed through a crowd of people who was trying to prevent the kidnapping of these 3 individuals. And the judge was so outraged, all 3 judges that heard these cases, that he freed everybody who was arrested. So clearly this was a groundless act and a case of real police brutality and ICE brutality against people who are defending their neighbors in our community.
In early March.
Yeah, just last week.
Yeah.
In early March in Vermont. So this is an egregious attack, not just on the rights of immigrants in this country, but also on all the neighbors who came and defended, because they were tear gas, pepper spray, hit with rubber bullets, and brutalized, as people have been testifying. So the question for us today, I think, really is, why is this happening? What's the root of ICE and Border Patrol? What are they doing in Vermont? How did they get to Vermont to begin with? And how can we stop them? I think those are the big questions that we're confronted with. And first, I think we have to understand the deep history of the border regime in this country, because that's the only way to come to grips with what's happening today. And I think you have to begin with remembering the origins of the United States as a settler colonial country where people came to a land that was inhabited by millions of native peoples, established colonies, and relentlessly expanded them, committing genocide in the process, then importing slaves, and then importing laborers who were free laborers that they exploited. And that's the origins of the U.S. as a society. And from the beginning, the whole intention of the settler colony was to expand its borders. And they did that in the aftermath of the American Revolution. One of the goals of the settler colonies was to expand westwards and to the south, which they did immediately after the American Revolution overthrew British rule in the colonies. And then they massively expanded the westward borders after the Civil War. So there was relentless expansion of the border. It wasn't defensive, it was offensive. They wanted to conquer territory, gobble it up, both for expansion of the slave economy of the South and for free farm labor coming from the North. As part of that process, the U.S. robbed whole sections of an independent state of Mexico. They gobbled up Texas, all of California, in relentless westward expansion. And really, the defensive mechanisms of the U.S. border regime only began to be enforced after the formation of the lower 48 states. So after the boundaries of the U.S. as it exists now in the lower 48 states, did the U.S. government turn to border enforcement. And initially, the U.S. ruling class took an approach of relative lax border enforcement because the expanding U.S. capitalist economy needed labor of all sorts. So people came in from Europe, people came in from Mexico, people came in from China, a huge influx that transformed and populated the country with a multiracial, multinational labor force that was essential to the expansion of U.S. capitalism. So the U.S. was happy to see migrant labor and only began to turn against migrant workers as an American labor movement began to develop at the end of the 19th century. And so then the US ruling class saw it as a key thing to split that labor movement along racial and national lines. And it began first with the Chinese Exclusion Act, when all these Chinese workers were brought to build the railroads of the United States and to work in California, were suddenly excluded, and that's when Border Patrol came into existence, was to expel all of the Chinese migrant workers. And initially the posture towards Mexico was, again, relatively lax. And all that Mexican workers had to do is report to a Border Patrol location, report that they were coming into the country to labor, and they were let in, because the migrant labor population from Mexico was the basis of the expansion of the entire agricultural industry of the south of the southwest of the United States, and especially of California. So the goal initially of Border Patrol was to regulate, not exclude Mexican labor coming into the country. They managed what was called a guest worker program, the Bracero program, and things really only began to change with that lax enforcement under Roosevelt in the 1930s, with the formation of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, which was formed in 1933. Initially, it was in the Labor Department, which is eye-opening because it shows the central role of immigration authorities in regulating labor flows into the U.S. economy. But then Roosevelt transferred it to the Justice Department in World War II, and their first act that the INS did with Border Patrol was setting up Japanese internment camps and building whole facilities, concentration camps, really, filled with Japanese people in the United States. The most famous one is Monsanto, as people probably have read about. And then into the 1950s, Eisenhower then abandoned the guest worker program and launched Operation Wetback against the Mexican laborers that had come into the United States as part of the Bracero program and as part of the initial formation of the labor force in agribusiness. And they deported tens of thousands of people, like overnight, through Operation Wetback.
That was Eisenhower again?
Under Eisenhower, yeah.
Well, yeah, the changing of the department and...
Yeah, no, the changing from the Labor Department to the Justice Department happened under Roosevelt.
Oh.
And that's what shifted it to now enforcement, especially against the Japanese initially, and then Eisenhower took it to a whole nother level with Operation Wetback, this mass deportation program. Ever since INS and Border Patrol have been used to enforce what you can only call American apartheid. That is a two-tier structure of legal labor and criminalized labor, racially criminalized labor. And it's similar, not identical, but similar to South African apartheid. It's very different than Israeli apartheid. Israeli apartheid excludes Palestinian labor, whereas South African apartheid worked to racially structure the labor force within South Africa through horrible past laws and racial discrimination. It's more similar in the United States how undocumented workers are treated. Essentially, they're held as criminalized but essential laborers. They are denied basic human rights, basic civil rights, and most importantly, right to unionization. So they are a criminalized, cheap labor force that are really the backbone of agribusiness in this country. You would not eat anything in this country without criminalized, undocumented workers who are highly racialized in this country. Same with construction. If you look at the construction industry all across the United States, same thing. Hotel industries. These are essential workers, as we learned during the pandemic, that keep up U.S. capitalism. So the whole situation of criminalized labor, racialized, criminalized labor, is essential to American capitalism. The Bush administration radicalized this entire apartheid system and took it to another level with the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, which was only in 2003. So this is a very recent entity. Only, 23 years ago was this thing formed. So the Department of Homeland Security now houses Border Patrol and ICE, which is a new entity, only formed in 2003, and Customs and Border Protection. Those are all housed under the Department of Homeland Security. And this was done in response to 9/11, and it took border enforcement to an another level of aggressiveness. They dissolved INS, incorporated everything into the Department of Homeland Security, establishing ICE, incorporating Border Patrol, and then they unleashed these police forces, which is what they are, on initially Arabs and Muslims in this country with horrific surveillance, interrogation, entrapment. And again, I want to point out that there's this dynamic of the connection between U.S. imperialism, a war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which was blowback to the U.S. wars in the Middle East, that caused 9/11 to begin with, and then the local domestic immigration enforcement authorities are tied up with that. So the first target of the Department of Homeland Security was the Arab and Muslim population, who are almost entirely uninvolved in anything bad at all, but they were criminalized under suspect and surveillance and entrapment as part of this new entity. And that setting up of the Department of Homeland Security with ICE and Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection agents was entirely bipartisan. The votes in the House and the Senate were almost unanimous, with everybody, Democrat and Republican, voting for the formation of this entity. So it's unsurprising that the Democratic Party under Obama and Biden, who inherited this new institution from the Bush administration, weaponized it in vicious fashion against the immigrant population in the United States. So as we know, Obama became known as the deporter-in-chief, and now still has the record for the most deportations in the history of any president in this country. Still. He deported 5.3 million people in his 8 years. The Biden administration, which succeeded the first Trump administration, deported in 4 years 4.6 million people. So they rank second. The Biden administration ranks second. And Trump is actually not caught up with the records that the Democratic Party set. So the border regime has been thoroughly bipartisan. Both parties have used it because it's essential for the functioning of American capitalism to maintain this apartheid labor structure that criminalizes a whole section of our labor force as cheap, poorly paid, racialized labor. Maybe I can finish, then we can get to questions. Just hold the thought. That explains how ICE came to Vermont. We should not be surprised. Number one, remember that Border Patrol is active everywhere along the border. And sometimes people in Vermont forget that the northern border is as important for Border Patrol enforcement as the southern border of the United States. So Border Patrol has been here for a long time. ICE has been operating since 2003 in Vermont, as Migrant Justice can testify to the number of detentions and deportations carried out against immigrant workers in the state. But there's a particular role the Democratic Party played in increasing the presence of ICE in our state, and that's Patrick Leahy, Senator Patrick Leahy, who is responsible for bringing and establishing the first ICE data facility here in Vermont in the 1990s. He brought that ICE data facility, which is called the Law Enforcement Support Center. It's the only one in this country, and it runs a national snitch line that turns in supposedly criminal immigrants to all of law enforcement, all of ICE, and all of Border Patrol all across the country. So this is the nerve center for the informing on immigrant workers in that country. That set the precedent then for a second institution to be set up, which is new and just being established out in Williston as well. And that's the National Criminal Analysis and Targeting Center, which will now surveil all of social media to do the same thing, to find undocumented immigrants, turn them over to law enforcement, Customs and Border Patrol, and to ICE agents to arrest them. And it's only one of two in the country. So Patrick Leahy is responsible for setting in motion a logic that has led to now Williston being internationally significant as an ICE center in Vermont. Thus, the Democratic Party, both locally and nationally, have collaborated with Republicans in setting up this racist border regime and enforcing American apartheid. The Trump administration has now radically transformed this and escalated it to an entire new level. With his big ugly bill, he plowed $170 billion into the Department of Homeland Security to increase the size of ICE and Border Patrol and unleash them on the immigrant population of the country. And together, the ICE and Border Patrol budgets is now the 7th largest military budget in the world. It has tens of thousands of agents, and they're being deployed by Trump in city after city to go after undocumented workers. And they are deporting people in huge numbers. Here in Vermont, we had 100 people detained last year alone, and 900 people from the northern New England area held in our jails on their way to deportation. And I think the key thing that I'll end on is that this assault on immigrant workers has backfired for the Trump administration because it has triggered into being a massive resistance movement in solidarity with migrants that we've seen erupt in LA, in Chicago, in Maine, and most dramatically in Minneapolis, where they organized a mass strike against ICE in the wake of the murder of Renee Good, and then another mass national day of walkouts in response to the murder of Alex Preddy. And Trump's popularity has sunk as a result. He's now down to 37% approval rating. The majority of the country has turned against his attack on immigrants, which is a positive sign of the potential to build solidarity with immigrants as part of rebuilding an American labor movement, which, if it's going to be rebuilt, has to overcome divisions of race and nation that our rulers use to divide and conquer us. So the last thing I'll just say is what we can do now. I think the number one thing that we need to do now is campaign to defend people when they're arrested and detained by ICE, like people did when ICE was deployed in South Burlington. The second thing we should do, everybody should join emergency response networks that Migrant Justice has set up, and we should campaign for the Burlington Police Department, the South Burlington Police Department, every single state law enforcement agency, including the state police, respect the fair and impartial policing policy and not collaborate with ICE, which is what they did last week in South Burlington. They worked hand in glove with ICE to carry out this travesty of justice that was meted out on that family and those 3 people who are thrown in jail. And we should then build campaigns in workplaces and all institutions to make them Fourth Amendment free zones. Fourth Amendment zones where there is no right to search and seizure without a warrant. And we need to get unions to do that in their workplaces, churches to do that. Every institution should bar ICE so that they can't come in, and bar Border Patrol so that they can't come in, so that undocumented workers are going to be protected. Because in reality, all our rights are at stake. Because if they can get away with this with migrants, they will come for us next. We all know the poem from World War II. First they came for the Jews, blah, 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 blah. We know how that poem ended. There was no one left for me. So the first line of attack we have to see as the first line of defense of all our rights, and build on that a real movement that has got social power, which is what's coming up on No Kings. Everybody should come out to No Kings, and we should raise the slogans: No Kings, no ICE, and most importantly, no war, because Trump has launched this horrific war in Iran, and that is going to rebound at home with further attacks on undocumented workers, Iranian people, Arabs, Muslims. So the war abroad is tied to the war at home, and we need to raise those slogans in No Kings. People should come to strike schools to get their unions ready to strike against the Trump administration, to defend immigrants, but also to defend all our rights, which Trump is carrying out a war on. And then you should come to May Day, where we're going to be marching in Williston on the ICE data facility, and we want as many people to come so that we have a show of power that we are going to draw a line in the sand after South Burlington, that ICE cannot do this anymore. And then the final thing I'll say is we have to raise the demand that ICE has to be shut down in Vermont. Those 2 facilities in Williston need to be shut down and not rebuilt anywhere else, and it's part of a movement to abolish these very new institutions, especially ICE, which is only created in 2003, so that immigrants can be protected, all our rights can be protected, and we can launch a much, much bigger fight for a world that puts people and the planet first, not profit.
Yeah, because those institutions are based on violence and racism, and that goes against Catholic social teaching, and it goes against most American values, except for militarism, which is, as a pacifist, I care about that. Did you have a question?
Well, just comment on that. I don't think that was the initial intention. I think when Patrick Leahy brought those institutions here, it was greatly praised, and it brought a lot of jobs into Vermont. That was a good thing, but it sort of morphed into this whole other entity.
Yeah. Right, because in 2003 it wasn't, it was always, as you outlined, Ashley, the situation about Border Patrol, I'm sorry, I think I might have just interrupted you. Let me finish that thought. Was always about racism, and then just whether or not you're tolerating the labor that's coming in. But in 2003, the vibe was different, and it wasn't so much in-your-face racism and white supremacy as the current administration helped that underbelly of disgusting immorality in the United States come out in 2016 and beyond, and then even more in this current one, because when the government says it's okay, then a lot of the sheepish kind of people say, okay, I can start hating people and be as white supremacist as I want. That's what is happening. That's continues to happen. Anyway, so when Patrick Leahy did that before 2003 or whatever,
Yeah,
it was
in the
not quite as bad
1990s.
as 1990s.
It was in the 1990s. That's when the ICE data facility was finally set up in Williston. It was in 1994. First it was in St. Albans, then it had another facility in Williston, and they built this giant new facility. But we should be clear, it was a racist institution back then, and it was arresting, detaining, and deporting people back then. And our point should be, these institutions shouldn't exist. And we should have jobs programs, but they should be good jobs programs that help people. Like, we've got a housing crisis. We need people building houses. We need people who are staffing hospitals. We need the billions of dollars. Trump has poured $170 billion into DHS. Imagine that going to hospitals, to schools, to rebuilding the infrastructure of our country. All our bridges in Vermont are falling apart. We've got climate disasters that happen every spring that drown cities like Barrie. We should have flood mitigation, all sorts of relocation of where people live so they're not on vulnerable waterways, rivers that flood now annually. So I'm all for jobs programs, but they should be socially positive jobs programs. There's nothing good or positive about ICE. There's nothing good or positive about Border Patrol. There's nothing good or positive about the border regime, because when you think about it from a class perspective, when they can pay people who are criminalized, racialized workers low wages, super low wages that you cannot live on, that sets a low bar that they drive all workers' wages down to. So instead of having those kind of jobs policed with these barbaric institutions, we should have good union jobs, and our federal government should spend the money to provide those, to rebuild the infrastructure, to build new housing, to build affordable housing, to staff hospitals, to overcome hospital deficits that are causing strikes that are happening right now, about to happen with nurses in Brattleboro. So I think that Leahy is part of the problem, not part of the solution, really. And that institution should never have been built, because it does nothing but harm to the immigrant population in our country.
The poem you were referencing before, I looked it up. I mean, there's multiple versions on Wikipedia, and it points out and I've heard this before in different ways, but I'll just read it out loud. First, this version. This one's from the Holocaust Memorial.
Pastor Niemoller.
Exactly. This one's by the British government, their version of what they think he said. It should be written down somewhere, so I'm not sure why there's so many versions, but this is one. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So I've heard different versions before, but I just wanted to share more of that. And the other thing you brought up when you reminded me of with ICE, and nothing good about that institution, and whether it's the building here and the demonic work or the evil work or whatever you want to call it, the unhealthy, unholy, sickening, violent work, the violent work that they're devoted to, is such a bad thing for the vibe of people that wanted to get a job as ICE, that are working for ICE. There's people that are having moral conscience crises that work with ICE, and just like Veterans for Peace, when people realize, I got drafted at age 18 and I thought it was a good thing to go do this thing, it was a good patriotic thing, and then I realized, wait a minute, it's messed up, and I shouldn't be killing people in this country, whatever decade it was when a person leaves the military. Those people that had a good Catholic or any kind of conscience formation, a moral conscience formation at any age, and then they get drawn into something in their teens or 20s, and somehow they come back, or they witness the violent bloodshed and say, I was part of that, or I supported that. Whether it's in ICE or in the military, there are people who are coming out. I look forward, I crave to hear who those people's stories are. And it's probably going to be in documentaries 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, after a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or whatever, if there's still people left. It's not, yes, things are going to continue to get worse, but there are ways that we can appeal to the consciences of folks, and I've seen that in Minneapolis, and I wasn't there, but seeing the videos of people trying to converse with folks. I've seen it in social media as well, where there's, like somebody said from a Catholic point of view, that anybody that's Catholic should not be working for ICE because of the fundamental violence that it represents and the anti-Christian methodology that ICE specifically these days represents. So anyway, there's still moral consciences, and there's still some hope there and it happened in the Soviet Union and other places when empires fall, that the soldiers and people say, wait a minute, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And they realize that part of them, the still small voice, can help. So like finding ways to build bridges are curious to me, like how we do that.
I was just going to say that we talk about abolishing ICE and all these, bad legal institutions, but we need to provide for a way for legal immigration. And I know there was a bipartisan bill not too long ago that it's not going to happen, but we're going to have an immigration reform. So how do we go forward with this?
Yeah.
From this
Well,
where we are, from where we are now?
I think you have to, like everything, the devil is in the details. So the closer you read the proposed immigration reform bills, the worse they look. Because what they maintain is border enforcement. And again, border enforcement does nobody any good, especially for the labor movement, because it's a trick to divide and conquer us and to set a very low wage floor that they can drive everybody down to. So once you have border enforcement, you've got a problem for a labor movement. Think about things practically, like the auto industry. The auto industry in the United States is a cross-border industry. It's in Canada, the US, and Mexico. For workers in that industry to establish a good wages and benefits, the unions have to be transnational. And so you can't accept the border logic from the standpoint of a working class person in the auto industry, because that's what they use to divide and lower the wages of workers in the auto industry. So I don't believe in borders, period, because I don't think they're in the interest of working class people. And think about it really concretely, like we're all bound together by globalization. Workers globally, we now work all for the same companies. Think about Apple. Design something in California, it builds the Apple phones in sweatshops in Shenzhen, China. It gets shipped by FedEx and other shipping corporations to the United States, and then a poorly paid worker at Amazon or in an Apple store sells and delivers a product. So we're bound together in this giant production chain, and the only way you can deal that as a worker is uniting across those kind of divisions to fight for common interests of working class people against our common bosses that are collaborating in our own exploitation. So I think the key thing is look back at those the immigration reform bills. They maintain the border enforcement, and that maintains the apartheid structure of the American labor market, and therefore racialized, criminalized, and dehumanized people who are robbed of their humanity and their civil rights and human rights at its very foundation. Then what they add to that to make it look good is a path to citizenship.
Right.
But if you look at the path to citizenship carefully, it's a path to nowhere, because to qualify for it, one, you've got pay, which for poorly paid workers is a huge demand.
Right.
Then any problem in your history is used against you. Minor criminal offenses are used against you. You're asked to return to your country of origin and come back. An incredible obstacle as well. So in the end, it's a way of maintaining the problem with a human face. And so that's what the Democrats have really always offered, is a false solution that doesn't really address the crisis, which is, why are people coming? And what are they used here to do? They're coming because the U.S. has destroyed Latin America through structural adjustment programs, military interventions, huge subjection of the economies to what they call structural adjustment programs. Privatize state-owned industry, open up to multinational corporations with destroyed peasant farming, have agribusiness corporations come in, buy up all the land, and then what do you do as a peasant who's lost your land.
Yeah.
You become a poor worker. Where do you go for a job when multinationals have swamped your economy? You have to come to the United States. So the US is the cause of the problem internationally, and then it polices the border to use these criminalized workers as cheap labor. It's a scam. When you really think about it, it's an evil scam. And what we need to do is be advocates of human rights for all, union rights for all, that the border regime has to be dismantled, and immigrants are not a problem.
And
Undocumented or documented, immigrants are not the problem. The people at the top that are controlling these big corporations that cause the problem for them in their home countries and exploit them here domestically, they're the problem. And they're the billionaires. And they got everything. And they control the government. So like this is what we have to challenge.
Thanks, there's about 4 minutes left, and this is from Catholic Social Teaching on the United States Conference of Bishops. Touches on both some of the points you guys have been making. That the 3 basic principles of Catholic social teaching on immigration are rooted and are spoken about in Rerum Novarum on the condition of labor in 1891. And it all goes back to Apostle Paul asserting the absolute equality of all people before God. There's neither Jew nor Greek, for you're all one in Christ, in Galatians. And in Christ, the human race is one before God. But these 3 basic principles, as the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops have pointed out, is that the first principle is people have the right to migrate to sustain their lives and the lives of their families. And the second 2 ones appeal more to conservative folks, because the second principle is a country has the right to regulate its borders and control immigration, and then people are going to argue left and right on the politics of like what that means to control it. And the third principle, a country must regulate its borders with justice and mercy. And ICE definitely does not have any
Either of
justice.
those.
And due process.
Yeah.
It's another key.
Which are being ripped up before our eyes. All our constitutional rights are on the chopping block. That's why I think that our slogan should be borrowed from the labor movement. An injury to one is an injury to all.
Amen.
That built the American labor movement. And one of the key things to remember, it was all immigrants who built the American labor movement. If you look at who built the American labor movement, was all these poorly paid, low-wage workers. And that's our heritage, is that radical immigrant labor movement. And that's why I think the most important labor force in this country is going to teach us everything. That is the immigrant labor force, is at the epicenter of the rebirth of a genuine social justice movement.
Yes. Amen. Any last words before we wrap up in the next